Welcome to Flat Ride of the Week, episode 14. Today we'll be talking about the long-requested monster-type rides. These rides have so much history that this video will have to be split into two parts. The first part will cover the more common monster-type rides like the ones made by Schwarzkopf and Eyerly, and the second part will be on Alex's channel and it will cover the less well-known monster-type rides. A link is in the description to part 2. It's also a good idea to subscribe to Alex's channel, as in a few weeks I will resume work at Cedar Point and Flat Ride of the Week will move over there to his channel. As always, if we forget anything or say something is incorrect, please politely correct us in the comment section below. Let's get started. So let's start off with the history. So the first monster type rides were made by an American company called Eyerly, and Eyerly actually has quite an interesting history. I like to think of them as sort of an American Huss, although way earlier than that. They've made so many different rides. So they were founded in 1930 by Lee Eyerly. This was, of course, in the midst of the Great Depression. Lee's goal was to create low-cost ways to train new pilots. And one of the products they created was the Orientator. Later renamed the Acroplane when it was changed into an amusement ride. And this ride was sold as a flight simulator with limited success. I believe they sold 5 models to the Cuban government, and that was it. When a carnival operator saw some of these rides, quote-unquote, sitting in the Eyerly lot, he inquired about maybe using them as an amusement ride. Lee was skeptical at first, but eventually caved and sold them as amusement rides, and as amusement rides, he actually sold over 50. These essentially worked as a plane-type model, with one rider inside and an electric motor powering a propeller, sort of like a plane. And the wind generated by that would allow the rider to control the plane by moving the control surfaces. It was essentially an early flight simulator turned into a ride. So the success of this ride led to the creation of multiple never-before-seen concepts like the Lupoplane, Rockoplane, Rolloplane, and what we're interested in today, the Octopus Spider and Monster. Alright, so moving on to these, we have the Octopus, so Eyerly's first design. This ride has 8 arms, each having one freely spinning car at the end, and each arm is connected to an off-axis point near the middle of the ride. This is sometimes called an eccentric. I believe is the more common modern term for it, though I could never really find what Eyerly called it. System allows the cars to move up and down as the ride rotates. Of course, this does have the drawback of you only being able to load part of the ride at a time and unload part of the ride at the time, while the other riders must sit up in the air. The Spider was a larger version of the Eyerly Octopus, featuring 6 arms instead of 8. However, each arm has 2 gondolas, allowing for higher capacity. It was a little more heavily built than the Octopus as well. And again, same exact system. All 3 of these, same exact system with a off-axis point that all of the gondolas are connected to, and that allows them to move up and down in the motions you see when the ride is in operation. Moving on, or actually I'm going to mention a lot of these rides with these eccentric systems were modified later on in life so that they could use what Schwarzkopf ended up using on all of theirs, which is simultaneous loading. You don't have to load only part of the ride at a time. And essentially what they did is make a raising and lowering eccentric system, so you could more easily obviously load the whole cycle at a time. As you can see in this footage here, this is one that's modified. I believe this is in Australia, Luna Park. So yeah. Then we have the Monster. This is the final evolution of the Octopus. This is the largest version. It's probably the most common nowadays, I would probably say, at least in permanent installations. Features 4 gondolas on each of its 6 arms. This ride even more heavily built than the Spider, obviously. It has a lot of quirks with this ride. All of these, because they're so old-fashioned. The interesting thing with these, and Cedar Point's in particular, is that these rides are, at least the ones built before 1971-ish, I don't know when exactly the change took place, but they are manually controlled. The operators have like throttles that actually control the movement of the ride completely. So they have to park it, they control the length of the ride cycle, they control the ride. So at Cedar Point, there's actually only 2 rides where operators still have a lot of manual control, and that's Gemini and Monster. They're both right next to each other. So Monster, I saw a lot. I've ridden it once, of all things, with one ride, but I've seen it a lot. Gemini Sea Brakes, which has to do with opening the mid-course, break run, basically. So I'm out there for 30 minutes at a time, and Monster's already open, so I just kind of sit there and watch it. So I did kind of get to learn how it was operated to a degree, obviously not to anything close to operating one. But it is very interesting to look at. The way these gondolas work is very different than what Schwarzkopf used, but we'll get to that in a bit. And yeah, it was a very visually impressive ride. I know whenever I looked at the Sea Breaks camera, I was blinded by the lights coming off of Monster. And I think that's about all I have to say about Monster. There was an interesting case. This is not Monster related, but it's Monster is in the story. Well, I went down to Sea Breaks one morning, and there was a storm coming in, but it didn't seem that far away. It was still way over Steel Vengeance. And I was sitting at Sea Breaks, and I was like, oh, that's kind of moving. I looked down, looked back up a little bit later, and it was way closer. And suddenly Monster goes down, and I hear them getting a call to go down. They go down, and I realize I'm stuck, quite a ways away from the station, and there's this massive storm rolling in. Luckily, I did get back to the station just before it started to pour, though. But yeah, that was an interesting story, slightly involving Monster. But yeah, I think then that is it for the Monster from Eyerly. Eyerly themselves actually closed forever in 1990 after a lawsuit caused by a 1988 accident on one of their traveling octopus rides where an entire arm broke off of the ride, killing the rider inside. It was actually determined by that the Florida showman, it happened in Florida of all places, had painted over cracks in the ride. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So it passed inspection. Eyerly closed in 1990. All of their rides have slowly become more and more rare, with many large chains, Cedar Fair in particular, removing an Eyerly ride at one of their parks to keep another park's Eyerly ride operational. It was actually Paramount that did this, but I'll mention it anyway. Canada's Wonderland had a Monster that they removed, and now the parts from that are keeping Kings Island's Monster in operation. Yeah, I think that is about all I have to say about Eyerly. Very interesting company. We'll definitely be talking about them again in a future Flat Ride of the Week. But we now have to move on to the European models. So, Alex, take it away with Schwarzkopf.
Okay, Schwarzkopf, they made their first Monster a lot later than Eyerly in 1967. The model was simply called Monster. The ride had 5 arms with spinning crosses at each end of the arm. The spinning of the crosses was controlled, but each cross has 4 free spinning gondolas, making a capacity of 40 people per cycle, which is quite a lot for a flat ride. Each arm had an individual eccentric system that made the arms go up and down. So the ride had 5 eccentric systems, not one big eccentric system like the Eyerly ones and the later Schwarzkopf ones. This one had for each arm 1 eccentric system, so the ride movement was kind of not natural. It was pretty weird. Only 2 of these were built. The first one was made for the 1967 World Expo in Montreal. After the expo, it went to Liseberg, and it later got relocated to Linnenmaki, where it got scrapped in 1985, and it got replaced by a Monster 3, a newer version of the Monster from Schwarzkopf. And then the second Monster 1 was built in 1969 for Parque de Atracciones de Madrid. It closed in 1986 because of a deadly incident. And then when the Monster became more popular in the 70s, the normal Monster rides from other manufacturers, Schwarzkopf made a newer version from the old Monster 1. So he developed it into a Monster 2, which was also transportable. It had the same capacity as the Monster 1, but it had a smaller footprint. The whole ride was angled a bit, and it has a different eccentric system.
So this eccentric system was very different than the Monster 1, obviously, as we said. It used basically a kind of angled vertical pull, where the eccentric could travel upwards, and then obviously off to an angle. So that allowed it to lower all of the arms for loading and unloading, but also the pole itself spins, which obviously creates and it spins in the opposite direction to the rest of the ride, which creates more erratic movements. Much more fun for the riders. The design of the pole itself is actually pretty similar to what you might see underneath like a Zamperla Samba balloon or a lot of wave swingers, obviously just a slightly smaller version.
Only 5 Monster 2s were built. The prototype debuted in 1971 on the German fair circuit, and it's still traveling in Germany. The 4 other Monster 2s were also built for German showmen, and 3 of them are still traveling. The last one built, the last Monster 2 built by Schwarzkopf, it ended up at Slagharen in the Netherlands, and it's also still operating over there. And then 5 years after the Monster 2 debuted, Schwarzkopf made another version of the Monster, the Monster 3. It had also 5 arms, just like the Monster 1 and 2, and it had the same eccentric system as the Monster 2. But instead of 4 gondola crosses, it had 5 gondola on each cross. The gondolas could also fit 2 people, but they were slightly bigger and heavier. So they increased the capacity to 50 people per cycle. It was available as both park and transportable version. The first Monster 3 was actually a park version. It debuted in Marriott's Great America, now Six Flags Great America. Debuted in 1976, and it is still in operation. This model became very popular on European fairs, but also in parks. Around 20 of them were built, and most of them are actually still operating. This is one of the few models that Schwarzkopf still produced when he retired in 1991. At the time he retired, they were making this Monster 3 you see now, but it was unfinished, so the company Stein, who took over the Schwarzkopf plant, they finished it. Stein went bankrupt quickly after they bought the plant. Then in 1992, Schwarzkopf's son, Wieland, bought the license to the Monster 3, and he started producing his version of the Monster 3, which was very similar to Schwarzkopf's one, just some small differences on the end of the arm. He only made park versions, and he refurbished some of Schwarzkopf's one. Wieland gave more variety to the model, and he made it available as a 5 or 4 arm version with 4 or 5 gondola crosses. He even made a 6 arm version with 5 gondola crosses, so it had a capacity of 60 people per ride. This one was located at Six Flags New Orleans, and it still sits abandoned in the park. Wieland stopped producing monsters around 2000 to focus more on new chains for Schwarzkopf coasters. Then Gerstlauer bought the rights for the monsters from Wieland, and they still produce them to this day. So Gerstlauer still makes very similar monsters to what Schwarzkopf ever made.
All right, and then on to the competition. And the competition this week is not really competition. It's really just similar variants of the monster ride design with an eccentric, just designed differently.
Well, only have one of these is sombreros. The first sombreros were most likely made by Soriani and Moser around 1994. Not sure about this. There is really not much information out there about sombreros. These sombreros are very similar to monsters, but instead of crosses with spinning gondolas, there is one big round gondola with riders facing to the inside. These gondolas can spin in both directions. Later, around 1997, Zamperla also made these sombrero rides. They were identical to the ones that Soriani and Moser made, and Zamperla actually still produces the sombreros. And Wieland Schwarzkopf also made one sombrero kind of ride with the same eccentric system as the Schwarzkopf Monster. It was built in 1995 in Portaventura, and it's called Serpiente Emplumada.
All right, and then to some of our very limited other facts.
Yeah, the first one is about Wieland Schwarzkopf again. He made some kind of monster with flipping gondolas. The model was called Absolute. It had 5 arms, and at each end of the arm it had spinning crosses with 4 gondolas located under the cross, unlike the normal Monster 3s which had gondolas above the cross. The gondolas could spin and flip freely. Only one ride like this was built, and it was called Sound Factory. It traveled on the German fair circuit. It debuted in 1997, This ride was very problematic. The main problem was the stability of the ride, caused by the very heavy gondola. One gondola weighed around 800 kilograms or 1,760 pounds. This is
Wow.
very heavy.
Yeah.
To compare this, a normal Monster 3 gondola weighs about 300 kilograms or 660 pounds. The Sound Factory stopped traveling in 1999, and it did one last fair in 2000, the Oktoberfest in München. But over there, on its last fair, it ran with the gondolas locked in place, so the gondolas couldn't flip anymore. This took away the popularity of the ride, and eventually the showman stopped traveling with it. It wasn't started until 2008, when German showman Eigner, they took it to Gerstlauer, and Gerstlauer completely refurbished it. The ride got a retheme and a new gondolas. The gondolas cannot flip anymore, and they are floorless. The gondolas are also about half the weight of the original gondolas, so it doesn't have any problems with stability anymore. And it's still traveling in Germany, named Parkour.
Wow. What a story. I think many people had probably heard of that ride because I think Theme Park Crazy mentioned it in his flat ride video, I believe. Very well-known ride, but I did not know the history behind it. Thank you. I think that about concludes everything we have to say about monster-type rides. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah. If you ever see a Schwarzkopf monster, say Monster 2 or 3, definitely ride it. It's very fun. I haven't been on a 2 personally, but I've been on a lot of Monster 3s, and they are so good. Some of them are very fast, and you can get airtime on.
It's about what I was gonna add before we closed. Was both the Schwarzkopf and Eyerly monsters are starting to disappear. You may not notice it yet, but they really are, especially just all over the place, really. There is one Schwarzkopf monster, obviously, at Great America. That's probably a close one for a lot of US people, so if you're near Great America, make sure to go ride it. It's called Lobster there. Awesome looking ride. I'm sad I missed it. And yeah, if your local park has an Eyerly monster or a Schwarzkopf monster, be sure to go ride it. You don't know how much longer that ride has left. But I think that about wraps up this video for Flat Ride of the Week, and I guess we'll see you guys next week.